What is the best real-world plot twists in history? Julius Caesar was captured by pirates who didn't know who he was. They demanded 20 talents of silver for his ransom. Caesar was offended and demanded they ask at least 50, which they got. Caesar joked that he was going to have them arrested and crucified when they let him go, which they all found very funny and laughed with him until they were arrested and crucified after they let him go. Chester Arthur was a product of the notoriously corrupt New York political machine. He was a notorious supporter and beneficiary of the spoils system, awarding government jobs to party members his entire career. Before becoming vice president, he was head of the New York Custom House, a symbol of waste, fraud, and incompetence among federal officers. He was nominated because he was a stooge of the leader of the New York machine, who was too notoriously corrupt himself to be electable. When he became president after the assassination of Garfield, Arthur shocked everyone and infuriated his friends and supporters by refusing to make the corrupt appointments his party demanded. Instead, he abolished the spoils system and pushed the Pendleton Act through Congress, establishing a federal civil service based on merit. TLDR, politician breaks promises he made to get elected, lauded for it. Olga of Kiev always comes mind. Her husband ruled Kievan Rus, a fairly large part of Eastern and Northeastern Europe. The Drevlians, part of the empire and a sort of city-state, rose up in protest and killed her husband when he came to collect tribute one too many times in a short time period. Then they figured, hey, let's fix this kerfuffle. Why doesn't our prince marry Olga and reunite the bond between our peoples? No one wants a civil war after all, Olga least of all, as there was no king on the throne to hold the other states in line. Yeah, her 3-year-old son was next in line, but not like that would have meant much to anyone in a civil war. The whole empire could potentially fall apart as different states allied and fought to fill the power vacuum. Well, Olga had her own plans. She buried the initial envoy alive. Then she sent back word that she accepted the marriage proposal but wanted to be escorted by a large noble escort as befitting her status. So practically all the Drevlian nobles showed up, and she offered them a large bathhouse to clean up from the long journey. She then burnt it to the ground with everyone in it. She then invited the Drevlian populace to a funeral for her husband, which was attended by many as it was basically a feast with free food and booze. She then ordered her soldiers to murder over 5,000 unarmed and drunken civilians. Finally she marched on their city. The Drevlians surrendered and offered to pay a huge tribute to spare their lives. So she granted the request and asked as tribute only for a bird from each house. Birds often nested in the roofs of these old houses. This was a seemingly kind and reasonable request that the city happily fulfilled. She then tied sulfur matches to the birds, lit them on fire, and sent them back and burned down the whole damn city. TL. Doctor Group rose up and killed the king. Wife wipes entire people off the face of the earth without even a fight and cements herself as the ruling power. Whitey Bulger ran organized crime in Boston from the late 70s to the early 80s, and no one could understand how he was getting away with it for so long since everyone knew he was doing it. Turned out he had a friend who was in the FBI and was an informant for the FBI. He would rat on other organized crime families, and once they were arrested he'd take over the territory. It was a win for his friend since he was making all the busts, and win for him since he would take over more territory. At the start of the Cold War, Henry Murray developed a personality profiling test to crack Soviet spies with psychological warfare and select which US spies are ready to be sent out into the field. As part of Project MKUltra, he began experimenting on Harvard sophomores. He set one student as the control, after he proved to be a completely predictable conformist, and named him Lawful. Long story short, the latter half of the experiment involved having the student prepare an essay on his core beliefs as a person for a friendly debate. Instead, Murray had an aggressive interrogator come in and basically tear his beliefs to pieces, mocking everything he stood for, and systematically picking apart every line in the essay to see what it took to get him to react. But he didn't. It just broke him, made him into a mess of a person, and left him having to pull his whole life back together again. He graduated, but then turned in his degree only a couple years later, and moved to the woods where he lived for decades. In all that time, he kept writing his essay, and slowly, He became so sure of his beliefs, so convinced that they were right, that he thought that if the nation didn't read it, we would be irreparably lost as a society. So, he set out to make sure that everyone heard what he had to say, and sure enough, Lawful's Industrial Society and Its Future has become one of the most well-known essays written in the last century. In fact, you've probably read some of it, although, you probably know it better as the Unabomber Manifesto. Source: I want to make it clear I just copied and pasted his, or hers, comment. In the 1960s, US spy planes were taking photos of Cuba. Those who analyzed them noticed something peculiar. They were building soccer fields. Cubans don't like soccer, they like baseball. Russians like soccer. This is how the Cuban Missile Crisis started. Chevalier d'Eon was a French diplomat and spy in England and Russia. Once he retired, he revealed to the public that he had been a woman the entire time. She was henceforth made to wear gender-appropriate clothing for the rest of her life. She went on to write some books and support the American Revolution. But here's the kicker. When she died, they found out she was actually a man the whole time. He was double cross-dressing. My wife is upset with me because this was supposed to be a troll account and I'm beating her top post by 1000. World War II story of Garbo, a man who wanted to help the Allies. After being rejected from being an ally spy from the British, went to the Germans and was recruited as a spy there. Made fictional sub-agents that would report to him. Then went back to the British and became a double agent. Received both the Iron Cross and member of the Order of the British Empire. Source: near the end of his life, Ernest Hemingway became increasingly paranoid that the FBI was following him and bugging his phones and reading his mail. This led to a total mental breakdown and he was institutionalized in the Mayo Clinic under an assumed name and underwent over 30 rounds of electroshock treatment. This led to Hemingway losing much of his memory, and thus, his reasons to write, and he killed himself. Decades later, after the Freedom of Information Act was passed by Congress, FBI files revealed that the agency was, in fact, doing all the things Hemingway claimed they were doing. They even bugged his phone in his hospital room at the Mayo Clinic. Before 2001, an FBI guy kept insisting to his higher-ups that Al-Qaeda should be a primary focus. They ignored him and thought of him as an annoyance. In 2001 they forced him into retirement. He left the FBI and took a job as head of security at the World Trade Center in August 2001. He died in the attacks about 3 weeks into his new job. In 1987, a Brazilian security guard took the day off work to go see the delightful Rome Herbie Goes Bananas. In his absence, thieves stole nuclear material that resulted in 4 people dying and 249 people being significantly affected by radiation. Only an accident. Johnny Cash recorded Ring of Fire by June Carter without knowing she wrote the song years before about being secretly in love with him and going to hell for it because she was a married woman. They didn't really know each other at the time, but many years later they met again after she was divorced and they did get married. Edit: I double checked the source of this story, and though they had no romantic relationship before recording the song, or until a while after, Johnny and June actually toured together, so they knew each other more than from just one meeting as I had thought. Edith Wilson, first female president of the US, elected in 1913. Woodrow Wilson was one of the most prominently public US presidents. He had a key role in geopolitics during World War I and the aftermath, as well as being highly public with a ton of speeches, meetings, and press availability, even for a president. After a global meeting in Paris in 1919, the president returned home, but in October had a significant stroke. Edith and only his closest advisors were aware of the stroke, which left the president unable to write, stand for long, and even speak at times. Edith decided that she had 2 options: either let the public know and basically give up on her husband's dreams, or take over the majority of his duties. So, she created a great rouse, telling the public the president would be retreating from the public eye to focus on his work, avoiding meeting with any press, his cabinet and the public. Edith essentially became president of the United States for the next year or so. She did ask for the president's advice when he felt well, but primarily, she was running the country. This wasn't known for many years later, but now she is generally recognized as the first acting female president of the United States. Not long after Madeleine McCann went missing, a family in the north of England also reported their daughter, Shannon Matthews, missing. Her case was pushed out of the media by the McCanns' more scandalous case, and the Matthewses, a working class family, claimed their plight was being unfairly ignored in favor of the more well-to-do McCanns, who were richer and better connected and able to sustain constant media attention by raising substantial funds. The family drew comparisons between Madeleine, a pretty kid, and their own daughter, who was rather more plain. Eventually public opinion in the UK started to turn in favor of the Matthews family, and they were given column inches, airtime, and even a documentary crew which followed them around as they conducted the search for their daughter. The search grew into a major missing persons hunt until, plot twist, Shannon Matthews was found alive at the house of the uncle of her mother's boyfriend, where she had been kidnapped and taken 24 days earlier against her will. Matthews' family had devised a plot to raise a large police reward, $50,000, for the safe return of their daughter, and then for this family acquaintance to find her, bring her to the police, at which point the adult family members would split the cash between them. Justice was served and they all did jail time. The Trojan Horse was a classic. Unsuccessful assassination attempts on the life of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife set up a chain of minor occurrences that resulted in the Archduke's driver taking a wrong turn, his car breaking down, and a minor player in the plot opportunistically shooting him outside the cafe where he just finished a sandwich. World War I would have happened at some point anyway, but the circumstances in how this situation played out are fascinating. Isaac Newton put himself in a self-imposed exile in his workplace after a fellow scientist named Robert Hooke betrayed him, allegedly stealing one of his theories and becoming famous for it. Newton worked hard and most importantly alone for most of his life. Of course we now know him for his work on gravity, and after Hooke's death Newton took down the only portrait of Hooke and threw it in a fire, so nobody would ever remember his face, which is why Newton is more well known than Hooke. The ultimate revenge. More recent, I thought it was a pretty good twist that Bin Laden was in Pakistan the entire time, and we probably knew it, and Pakistan's GVT did too. The Germans built a ship disguised as a British ship. The first ship the Germans encountered was the original British ship, which sunk them. I can't remember the name of it though. Dee Dee Blanchard case. Dee Dee was the perfect mother who took care of her disabled daughter, Gypsy, single-handedly. One day, Gypsy murdered Dee Dee and an elaborate lie unfolds. Gypsy wasn't disabled. Her father wasn't a deadbeat alcoholic who ignored them. Christianity went from being one of the most persecuted religions to being the biggest in the world. I doubt anyone from that time saw that coming. Also, Australia losing the Great Emu War was a good plot twist. 1871 Germany declares itself as a country in Versailles, Paris, completely humiliating the French. 48 years later, after World War I, France takes away everything they could from Germany. Pilgrims land in America. Meet a friendly native who speaks English. Napoleon returning from Elba to retake France. 1900 flying was impossible. 1969 we went to the moon, haven't really done much else since. In the middle of the Pentagon, outside right in the middle, used to be a food stand during the Cold War. The Russians used to see people at the Pentagon constantly going to that stand during the day and figured it was a secret entrance to a war room or something. They had a nuke specifically pointed at that food stand. Jesus was God the whole time. You thought you were fighting against Austria-Hungary, but you were actually fighting against me, Germany. The year is 1683. Austria has been devastated by many large wars throughout the century. Their rivals, the Ottoman Empire, want revenge for 1606. The Ottomans lay siege to Vienna, and it looks like it's all over for the Habsburg Empire when suddenly, Polish fighters unexpectedly come and are able to completely destroy the Ottoman forces. This leads to the siege being lifted, the Ottoman military being all but destroyed, and the end of Ottoman attempts to take Vienna. No one expected the Spanish Inquisition. Roger Ebert dated a woman in Chicago that also worked on TV. She wasn't sure what to do, as her career was stalling. Ebert suggested that she take a little morning show and syndicate it, like he and Siskel did with their movie review show. Eventually Ebert and the woman broke up, after only a couple of dates, but she took his advice and syndicated her show. She did okay for herself. All of your history was fake to make it look like the world didn't start from the glory of best career. Best career is best career. Mother Teresa had a crisis of faith for the last 40 years of her life and was basically just going through the motions. Rorke's Drift. 4,000 Zulus surround approx. 150 British soldiers at a small farmstead shortly after the main Zulu army of 20,000 completely wiped out the 4,000-man British army at Isandlwana, about 20 miles away. The twist? The British soldiers at Rorke's Drift survive. The Philippines asked for the US help against Spain only for the US to come around and say, "Whoa, we didn't help free you from Spain. We conquered you from Spain." Bill Cosby, accused of abuse and sexual assault of 59 women. Here's some blankets, then plot twist. The time that the British, French, Australia, New Zealand, and a couple other countries were going to invade the Ottoman Empire only to suffer heavy losses and lose. Or the time that a young German army officer assigned a desperate soldier to infiltrate a radical political group and then the soldier starts to like what the group says and takes over Germany. President Obama was supposed to be the end of racial divisions in America, but now it's worse than it has been in a long time. In 1948, 5 countries attacked a one-day-old country named Israel. That country actually won. In 480 BC, a small force of 300 Spartans led by King Leonidas, plus about 800 other dudes, made a legendary last stand at the Battle of Thermopylae against the absolutely massive Persian army, inflicting very high casualties on the Persian forces before finally being encircled and killed in action. This battle is credited for the victory of Greeks over Persians. They were about 1,000 dudes, facing off thousands and thousands of enemies. I still can't believe the size of their balls. Monica Lewinsky saved her dress. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte was a career soldier who fought bravely as one of Napoleon's marshals for many years, who was then suddenly elected King of Sweden and eventually joined forces with the Allied powers in order to repel a French invasion. The Swedish ship Gothenburg set sail on a half-around-the-world trip to China in 1743. It was a very perilous and tumultuous journey that involved countless storms and wrong turns. But the ship finally returned safely to Swedish coasts more than 2 years later, packed to the brim with Chinese luxury goods. Then it sank less than 1 mile before reaching harbor. My dad thinks he is the greatest driver ever. Got on Netflix while he was driving. Australia waged a war on emus once. Full stop. Full stop. Full stop. Full stop. Full stop. Full stop. Plot twist. They lost. Most people know Adolf Hitler by his wonderful artwork, but few people know that he was actually responsible for mass genocide against the Jewish population. White supremacist finds out he's part black. Edit. He's his to his. After losing 157/169 ships at the Battle of Chilchioliang, just about their entire fleet, the remaining 12 Korean ships beat back a Japanese fleet of 300 ships sent to destroy them, losing not a single ship and destroying 60 enemy vessels at the Battle of Myeongnyang. 2 months later, after this, Korea would proceed to win the war. It may be proper to compare me with Nelson, but not with Korea's Yi Sun-sin, for he has no equal. Japanese Admiral Togo, Yi being the brilliant admiral of Korea during the Korean-Japanese War. I think how Sisi became president of Egypt is the biggest plot twist in the decade. The Battle of New Orleans, more than the Battle of New Orleans, was an engagement fought between the 8th of January and the 18th of January, 1815, constituting the final major battle of the War of 1812, and the most one-sided battle of that war. American combatants, commanded by Major General Andrew Jackson, prevented an overwhelming British force. commanded by Admiral Alexander Cochrane and General Edward Pakenham, from seizing New Orleans and the vast territory the United States had acquired with the Louisiana Purchase. The treaty ending the war was signed 15 days before the start of the battle. Gonna have to go with this. It was right below this post. Huh. Tom Wheeler, head of the FCC, recent history, was a lobbyist for the cable and wireless industry. Basically tried to make cable monopolies legal and Comcast loved him. He was selected as the new head of the Federal Communications Commission and then turned a 180 and has been fighting for net neutrality and against monopolistic ideals ever since. The fact that after thousands of years of world building and local filler episodes we finally started to get an arc with the English Commonwealth, American and French revolutions, Industrial Revolution, World Wars, Cold War, and global economic crisis, took a while but so worth it. Donald Trump's hair is real. Trump may very well be the next leader of the free world. On a real grand scale, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In June 1989 the entire communist bloc was on the way to stay more or less intact and probably just transform in a similar fashion to China. In June 1990 there was no communist bloc anymore. In June 1991 there was no unified Soviet Union anymore as several republics demanded out. In June 1992 the country known as Soviet Union was history. In 1974 Jack Nicholson found out that his older sister June was actually his mother and that the people who he knew as his mother and father were actually his grandparents. People who don't know what a plot twist is. Wilhelm Canaris, head of the German Abwehr, was actually sending secrets to the British. Stalingrad, the invaders were quite surprised when they had to leave. America winning the Revolutionary War. Tell someone in 1750 that England would be brought down by a bunch of religious separatists and see what happens. Hey Russia, it's Hitler. Remember that treaty we signed? The one that said we wouldn't invade you? Well, duck you. Prior to the Battle of Antietam in the American Civil War, Confederate Maj. Gen. Capital D. Capital H. Hill accidentally left the top secret plans for moving troops to attack Harper's Ferry, wrapped in an envelope with 3 cigars. In Frederick, MD, when his battalion moved out the plans were left on the ground and later discovered by Union Corporal Barton W. Mitchell of the 27th Indiana Volunteers, who passed them to his leadership. The attack on Harper's Ferry was stopped and Union troops went on to win, at great cost and subsequently not follow up on, the Battle of Antietam, where Corporal Mitchell was sadly mortally wounded. Edit. Source. Special Order 191. The plan was simple. In Sarajevo, 1914, Gavrilo Princip and his group known as the Black Hand would throw a live grenade under a carriage carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in a carefully plotted assassination. However, the grenade unexpectedly delayed, rolling into the street and exploding just as the next carriage rolled by. Princip was so overcome with panic that he swallowed a cyanide pill, poison, and jumped into the river nearby, preferring to drown himself rather than face the ramifications of his mistake. Plot twist. Rather than killing him instantaneously as he had hoped, the cyanide only made him vomit. That, combined with a deceivingly shallow river, only about 6 inches or not very conducive to drowning, only made poor Princip feel even more like a failure. He decided to deal with dejection the same way many of us do, so by eating his feelings at a restaurant nearby. Meanwhile, Archduke Franz Ferdinand instructed his driver to take he and his wife to the hospital so they could visit the victims of the freak explosion earlier that day. However, the driver got lost, and when he put the car in reverse to turn around he accidentally stalled the engine out. Where did the car break down? Right in front of the restaurant where our dejected would-be assassin happened to be grabbing a bite, having his target served to him on a silver platter. He simply walked outside, aimed his gun and fired point blank, so triggering the single most revolutionary event in modern history, World War I. Strom Thurmond having a half-black daughter. During the Cold War, the US wanted to spy on Soviet naval bases. The Soviets were not in favor of this idea. The Soviets were aware of this monitoring and often tried to deceive our satellites. In one instance, Our satellites took pictures of a Soviet submarine yard on a particularly windy day, and analysis showed that all of the boats were bowed. The Soviets had been substituting large balloons for submarines, either so that we would think that they had more subs than they did, or so that we would believe subs to be in the yards when they were actually out at sea. Source: Bob Graham, Jeff Nussbaum, Intelligence Matters, the CIA, the FBI, Saudi Arabia, and the failure of America's war on terror. The second plane hitting the World Trade Center on 9/11. Julius Caesar gets brutally stabbed in the Senate. Everyone is already freaking out. They don't know who's going to succeed Caesar. Will it be an elected consul or an heir? By popular demand, people are betting on Mark Antony, as he is assumed by everyone to be Caesar's legal heir, as he is one of his most trusted generals, his second in command, his leading man in the Senate as consul, and his praise of Caesar was sure to raise his own personal status. Up until the last moment, that was who people assumed would be Caesar's heir. Then his will is read and it turns out his adopted heir was some random 19-year-old in his extended family, Gaius Octavius. Caesar probably made an educated decision, as he saw Mark Antony as more brutish and the now Octavian as more calculating. The Romans, however, were completely blindsided. It came out of nowhere. Giant lizard monsters ruled Earth for millions of years to die as a result of a rock from space hitting said Earth. Bin Laden being at his house all that time. Hopefully for Shannon it's a distant memory and she is happy. Sadly, I fear for Madeline's fate. Alger Hiss was a Russian spy. It wasn't just some Richard Nixon crazy conspiracy making stuff up imaginary communists. There were people in that wooden horse.